you beautiful people, Aaron here, back with another video. For almost 2 years now, we have been in dire need of a character to shred animo resistances. Well, at least one that's not Zhongli or locked behind a constellation. That brings Faruzan, one of the newest characters to come into the Genshin roster. How good is she though? Does she do her job well, or is she just another 4-star dud? Well, let's find out. But before we do, we got begging and disclaimers. So just know that all calculations later on in the video are done at high yet reasonable investment. You could definitely go beyond, though it may be hard. There are also chapters in the description for you all to peruse at your leisure. And remember, if you like my stuff, please like, comment, and subscribe. Time to move on. So let's start off by answering the question of what can Faruzan do? Well, Faruzan has a very specific niche in being an animo buffing support, while also acting as a very solid sub-DPS option. And like all other animo supports, she also comes with some good grouping capabilities. Her skill is where her grouping capabilities lie, as it deals animo damage in an AoE. When this happens, her next charge shot will yoink enemies toward the center of where the arrow landed after a short period of time, as well as deal animo damage. This yoink is called a pressurized collapse, and this is also what generates her elemental particles. Her particle generation is only 1 to 2 particles though, and her particle generation has a 5.5 second cooldown, meaning that she will struggle harshly with energy. While her skill may have some goods and bads, her burst only has goods. Faruzan's elemental burst moves in a triangular pattern. When it reaches the corner of its triangular pattern, it deals an intense amount of damage. Then it goes to the next corner, and that repeats until its duration is up. When it pulses out damage, if a party member is nearby, her burst will buff the party's animo damage percent based on talent level, and will also reduce the animo resistances of enemies by 30% when her burst deals damage to them. Now we have her ascension passives, her first of which allows her charge shot after using her skill to charge up a lot quicker, as well as allows her pressurized collapses to shred animo resistances like her burst. Her fourth grants even more buffs to animo damage, as it grants this elemental damage type a small flat damage bonus based on her base attack. She also has normal elemental ICD throughout her kit. As per usual, it's time for constellations, but this time we'll be looking at the bonuses and impact of each constellation other than the boring 3rd and 5th. So let's check out her C1. Faruzan's first constellation allows her skill to turn her next 2 charge attacks into her special charged attack. This would allow for more damage and grouping, but if you're looking for more energy generation from this effect, you're out of luck. The only instance where this would happen is if you use her at the start of a rotation and hold onto her second charge attack right before you throw out your main DPS character. Obviously, this is very clunky, so it's not entirely recommended, which means this constellation is lackluster. What about her C2? Well, this constellation is actually really good, as it increases the duration of her burst by 6 seconds. This means that her burst will get a 50% damage increase, as it goes from hitting 6 times to now 9 times. It also means that her buffs and debuffs go from having an 80% total uptime to now 110%. This might seem really good already, but it becomes basically necessary with Xiao, as he straight up gets more on-field time for himself to shine due to her increased uptime. In fact, Faruzan's burst actually has a longer duration than Xiao's burst with her C2, which allows him to stay on field for the entire duration and still benefit from all of her buffs. At lower constellations, he would lose it toward the end of his burst if her burst was not used right before his. Onto her C4, which allows her pressurized collapses to restore a flat amount of energy to herself from 2 to 4, based on the amount of enemies she hits with it. This is just absurdly important, as it works really well with her C1, which now allows both arrows to generate energy. Pairing this with Sacrificial Bow allows for 4 pressurized collapses, or 8 to 16 energy, plus the energy she gets from her particle generation, which is about 6. While this is not a lot, it's better than the 12 energy she gets at lower constellations with about 200% energy recharge. This constellation may help with her energy issues a bit, but with her C6, all of these issues are completely fixed. Faruzan's C6 does 2 things. The first thing is it grants a 40% crit damage bonus to animo damage when they are under the effect of her buff. While this is massive and incredibly good, her C6 also allows the active character under the effect of her buff to trigger her pressurized collapses once every 3 seconds when they deal any type of damage to an enemy. This allows Faruzan to not only deal more off-field damage, but it also gives her more persistent grouping potential, which now only her and Venti have, as well as more energy generation as her pressurized collapses generate energy particles and flat energy to herself. It's to such an extreme degree that this increase in energy generation from C0 to C6 is about 400%, which allows her to not have to worry about energy generation. The fact that she can now generate energy particles off-field means that she can also serve as an off-field battery for her main DPS. This constellation is incredibly strong for her and is nearly a must, as it fixes all of her issues and amplifies everything she is already good at. So let's take a look at her power levels between C0 and C6. At C0, Faruzan struggles incredibly hard with energy, as at base, she's only generating 4.5 energy for her 80 cost elemental burst. This generally means that ER is her most important stat at lower constellations, and the emblem set is almost a requirement. However, as stated before, her energy requirements drastically plummet on her journey to C6 due to her 4th and 6th constellation when combined. This means you could freely run any set that would be beneficial to you, like a Noblesse for more buffing potential, Iridescent Venereer for teams where you want to use her as the only Animo unit, or even Tenacity of the Millilith if you're a masochist, since her pressurized collapses count as skill damage. Another difference is her damage output, which is increased by an absurd amount from her C2 and C6. With her C2, her burst gets about a 50% damage increase, and her C6 plus her C1 grants her 9 times the amount of pressurized collapses compared to C0. That being said, her total damage output is generally increased by about 300% from C0 to C6. That's absurd. That plus the fact that at C6 she now acts as an off-field battery, she now grants crit damage, and she now has incredibly persistent grouping, make the difference between C0 Faruzan and C6 Faruzan night and day. They're practically two different characters at that point. So I took this into account for the rest of the video, as this matters. It matters most when concerning energy recharge, as like stated before, she generates about 4 times the amount at C6. So with artifact sets, your best one at C0 is Emblem of Severed Fates, specifically due to the energy recharge it grants her, as well as the bonus damage it grants her burst based on her energy recharge. It does so much for her and is basically required. However, if you could build her this way, Noblesse Oblige is good too for its buffing capabilities, but you're still going to need a crap ton of energy recharge on her. How much? Well, let's get into her main and substats. For her main stats at C0, you're going to want energy recharge on the sands, and then put damage percent or just attack percent on the goblet, and crit on the circlet. This is no matter the set you use on her at lower constellations, as you really need a high energy recharge on her. 200% is the bare minimum, but mainly aim for 250%. The reason why attack percent is fine on the goblet here is because she has so many different sources of damage percent with emblem and her own buff, but she lacks a lot of base damage, though it's really based on the substats of the goblet more than anything else. Speaking of, for substats, again, you need lots of ER. You need too much, and even then, too much isn't enough. Then the normal crit and attack percent. What about C6 though? What are you looking for? Well, since a lot of damage is coming from her elemental skill plus burst instead of just her burst, and since she does not need as much energy recharge, you don't really need to use emblem anymore. You still can, but it's not really recommended. Instead, Noblesse grants her similar elemental burst damage while also granting attack percent to the entire party. This is her best support set, but if you want more personal damage, any combination of attack percent 2 pieces and or animo damage percent 2 pieces will do just fine. For main stats, you'll want to run attack percent, animo damage percent, and then crit. And substats is the normal crit energy recharge up to about 160% and then attack percent. Though we know that tenacity is just a joke, but why not run Viridescent at all? Well, that's just because her damage is huge. At talent level 10, her burst has a talent multiplier of 679.68 per hit. To compare with all of his declension stacks, Haze's punch has a total talent multiplier of 1023.81 at level 10, and the Raiden freaking Shogun's talent multiplier on the initial slash of her burst at talent level 10 is 721.44. It's just slightly less than both of these high damaging abilities, but it also hits either 6 to 9 nice times. For another comparison, at talent level 10, the total talent multiplier from Ayaka's burst is 4143.72, while Faruzan's burst has a total talent multiplier at C0 and talent level 10 of 4078.08, then at C2 it's 6117.12. To compare, using a full EM Viridescent set for her with perfect EM stats and with Elegy of the End, her swirls are going to hit for 6412 damage. Against 3 enemies, that's going to be about 38,472 damage. This can happen only once every 2 hits of Faruzan's burst though, which means it will only occur about 5 times at C0, which will deal about 173,000 damage, and 13 times at C6, which would deal 500,000 damage. Now let's take a look at how much damage she's going to deal using a weapon that you all voted for, which turned out to be the Favonius Warbow. Using this weapon at C0 with emblem and C6 with Noblesse, her damage per tick of her burst is almost 25,000 damage at C0 and 41,000 damage at C6. Against 3 enemies, her total burst damage at C0 is almost 450,000 damage, while at C6 it's about 1 million damage. Yeah, that's a lot. Over 2 times the damage of the swirls. So Viridescent, why? You can use this, but Sucrose is better, and you need to be on field for Viridescent to work, which just pairs a lot better with Sucrose. That being said, this is also why I don't recommend building EM for her. Building her as a buffing DPS is generally just better. So let's look at her weapons for damage and utility. First, let's see how each weapon impacts her Ascension 4 buff. Since her Ascension 4 buff is only affected by her base attack, the weapon you choose for her is the most important part about this damage buffing source. So let's see how much flat damage each weapon gives. As you can see, the weapons are all within 100 flat damage of one another, because the flat damage amount she grants based on her base attack is almost nothing. However, it does still help buff the other animal characters you have in your party, though it is important to keep in mind. With this considered, we're generally going to want to stray further from the weapons toward the bottom, as they offer less buffing potential than the others. Now let's take a look at her best damaging weapons at C0 using her entire kit with a full Emblem of Severed Fates set. Obviously, the 5-star weapons are toward the top, along with the Ally Hunter due to its crazy good damage output. And we have Viridescent and the % damage boosting weapons after those initial 4. After those are the more supportive weapon options and that crappy fish. However, with Faruzan being at C0, she needs a violent amount of energy recharge due to her absurdly poor energy generation. With that in mind, I would say that at C0 and other lower constellations, her best weapons would be Favonius and Sacrificial First, as they grant the highest amount of energy to herself. Favonius is easier to utilize, but Sacrificial can be great for some extra grouping at lower constellations and pops off at C4. This weapon also has a pretty high base attack for better buffing potential. Then there's Elegy of the End, which has even more buffing capabilities as well as energy generation and the second strongest buff for her Ascension 4 passive. After that is Fading Twilight for the % damage increase, third highest base attack for some pretty great buffing, and some great energy recharge for her to use. After that are the weapons that offer her a lot, like Polar Star for its insane damage output and second largest Ascension 4 buffing, and then Skyward for a similar reason. Then we have Viridescent, which really helps with some consistent and persistent grouping, which can be very beneficial for some characters. After that is Ally Hunter for some crazy good damage to her entire kit, plus decent Ascension 4 buffing. And lastly are the weapons you should consider getting an upgrade from. Now, what about C6? At this point, she does not suffer from such extreme energy issues, and she has really consistent grouping capabilities. So both of those things we no longer need to consider. This just means we could focus purely on the DPS each weapon grants Faruzan, as well as the buff each weapon grants with her Ascension 4 passive. So let's take a look here at what her total damage output would look like at C6 with a Noblesse Obliged set and only using her burst. Taking a look, we could see that the 5 stars are up at the top once again, but Elegy has fallen some to make up for the other buffing and utility it grants. Viridescent is still very high due to its crazy good stats, and Stringless shot up too because we aren't using her charge attacks, and since her charge attacks take up less of her total damage output this time. Then we have Moen's Moon and Fading Twilight, both of which offer some great % damage bonuses and great Ascension 4 passive buffing. After those are again just downgrades. So at C6 I would recommend Polar Star first because its damage is just crazy good. Along with it is Elegy due to its high damage and really good buffing potential. These two I consider on the same playing field, as one offers more personal damage while the other offers more utility. Skyward deals a bit more damage than Elegy and grants a higher Ascension 4 buff, but it's not to the point where it makes a large difference in her damage. After those are Viridescent, just due to the high damage it grants. The grouping at this point is just a bonus. Stringless is next since it buffs all sources of Faruzan's damage at this point while offering a decent buff on top. Then we have Ally Hunter, Moen's, and Fading Twilight, all of which offer some great damage and buffing capabilities. The weapons after those should be dropped at this point, as they will do better with her at lower constellations. Time for synergies. We'll start with the obvious ones with Zhao and Wanderer, both of which are strong main DPS characters. The Wanderer benefits highly from the buffs Faruzan grants. I mean, obviously, he's an Anemo main DPS, why wouldn't he? The great thing about her is that she's also able to battery Scaramouche with her C6, as well as group enemies for Scara to hit multiple enemies with his small AoEs. Zhao also gains most of the benefits above, but he benefits more from the grouping since he likes to knock enemies away from himself with his lunges. With Faruzan, he will no longer have to worry about scattering enemies that might have been grouped previously. Her elemental burst uptime is also incredibly long and synergizes extremely well with Zhao's burst uptime. Even though he does benefit from Faruzan more than Scara, Scara is actually able to benefit from the battery potential that Faruzan brings at C6, while Zhao cannot. In any case, she is undoubtedly the best support for both of these characters. A step down from them is using Hazo with her, as he gets benefits from everything, but since his numbers are smaller than the other two, he benefits extremely from the flat attack buff that she grants. However, this only works well as a main DPS Hazo. When he's not a main DPS, you're better off with other characters. Now there's one other situation that she is fantastic in, and that's with Jean in a Sunfire comp. Jean already has some intense burst damage. With the buffs from Faruzan, her own personal damage shoots shoots through the roof. The fact that she will be constantly triggering elemental reactions in an AoE also helps with eliminating elemental shields. Jin also has a constellation that reduces animo resistances, which when paired with Faruzan's animo shred plus flat damage bonuses, animo damage bonuses, and animo crit damage bonus, will have the team's animo damage nuking the enemy. All of this plus Bennett's gargantuan attack buff is just ridiculous. So how does Faruzan look? Well, she's looking quite strong, especially for a recently released 4-star. She's able to super buff the animo cast while also acting as a sub DPS option. Her damage is nothing to scoff at either, as it can reach the same heights as the base damage of the 5-star main DPS unit she is supposed to support. Along with that, she is also the only character other than Venti with persistent AoE grouping in the entire game. She could also serve as a battery at C6 too, which makes her much stronger with her animo friends. However, most of these benefits are only at C6, in which she becomes a very strong unit. Before then, she is a valuable pick, but with major energy issues. She has such harsh issues that you need to devote most of your build to energy recharge instead of an actual DPS or support build. Before C6, she also struggles with usage outside of being just an animo support, whereas with it, she can be used even outside of her own niche. She's a lot like Kujo Stara in a sense, as her reliance on her C6 for a lot of her usability is her biggest detriment. Without it, she will struggle, but unlike Kujo Stara would with Electro before C2, Faruzan will still act as an animo supporting powerhouse no matter the constellation. Faruzan seems like a very capable unit since she is an animo Kujo Stara, Goro, and Shenhe. However, she has the same drawbacks as them, as she cannot be used outside of her own elemental niche very effectively. Her energy recharge issue is her worst offender, as it makes her usability specifically rely on her C6, making her an extremely expensive unit to have up and running. Outside of that state, all she could do is buff animo characters. That's not particularly a bad thing, but it's not too awesome when half of a character's kit is locked behind a single constellation. So, like I did with the rest of this video, I will rate them separately. I would have to give a lesser constellation Faruzan a 2 out of 5 stars, because at this point she only offers animo buffing and mediocre amounts of damage output with insanely bad energy requirements. Her buff is worse than Bennett's, and she will not be able to offer a great amount of damage to compensate for the damage difference between the two. However, at C6, she becomes a very strong animo support, a persistent grouper, and a very valuable sub-DPS character that can be used in a variety of situations and team comps. At this point, she seems more like a 3.5 out of 5-star option due to her versatility and for her being able to act as a sub-DPS grouper and buffer. However, she is just worse in those categories than a Jean, Kazuha, or Sucrose would be, simply because of the mere fact that only she will be benefiting from her own buffs, while the other three would offer the same to their team plus more. That aside, what do you all think about Faruzan? Are you pulling for her? What comps do you plan to use her in? Tell me your thoughts in the comments down below. But with that, I will skedaddle. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye bye!